One. Hey everyone, Dr. Tim and Hilary here for another version of Dr. Tim's Aquatics podcast. How you doing this morning, Hilary?
Doing good. Sitting here, got my cup of coffee. Just finished dosing my big tank with waste away. I'm ready to talk about being prepared for emergencies.
Yes, that's the topic today, everyone. Being prepared for emergencies. And when you think about it, no matter where you live, there's probably some natural disaster that's going to strike. And we're going to talk about how to prep your aquarium when you know something's coming, or they tell you to plan that something's happening, and then what happens when it's actually upon you, and then afterwards. So
Yes.
Let's get started.
All right. So just like a list of some of the ones, and as I went through this list originally, I thought about more. So, fires, the big one that comes to mind right now is hurricanes. Elsa just made her way through Florida and up the coast. Also floods that, come with some of these. Tornadoes. Not so much in the summer that you're going to see cold spells, but definitely heat waves for sure. I know that's something that I personally have dealt with in the last 2 months in Vegas. It gets very, very hot. So being prepared for all of
records.
these. Huh?
Yeah, they're setting heat records in Vegas, breaking all the records.
Yes, yes.
And there's also ice storms. And nowadays, here in Southern California, they get proactive. We get our high winds that always come in the fall. And because that can generate down power lines, what the utilities are doing in some cases is they turn off the power proactively. So the power lines haven't gone down, but they could go down. And both my office and house are in areas that they've determined are pretty high risk areas. So they just turn the power off.
Wow.
Yeah, so that's a whole new twist. They just started doing this last year, and people are not happy. It was off for 3 days at one stretch.
What? Oh gosh.
So what do you do with all that?
Right.
Yeah. So the other thing that we get out here a lot is earthquakes. And unlike many of the other types of natural disasters, you don't know an earthquake's coming. It just hits. But for hurricanes and ice storms and heat, there's and so you can prepare. And in general, with all these, what's going to happen? You're going to lose power, and that means you're going to lose water movement and aeration. And that's what you have to think about most, is you need to keep air in the water, because obviously that's what keeps your organisms alive. And so you have to keep air in and figure out how to add air, and also minimize what's consuming the air. Because as we'll discuss, it's not just your fish and corals that are consuming oxygen out of your water. Your bacteria consume a lot of oxygen and produce things that you'd rather not have them produce while you don't have any filtration.
Yes, that's definitely something important to note. It's interesting, when I was kind of doing a little bit of prep work for this, one of the things that I read online was feeding your fish, like especially some of these things that, if they're coming, you might know if it's going to be windy that there's a chance of a power outage, but not feeding as much, or, not feeding your tank at all is one of the things that I read. And they were saying that sometimes when people, like the wholesalers and the people that are shipping and transporting fish and stuff, that they oftentimes don't feed them for 24 to 48 hours before, which not sure about that, but.
Well, actually, that's true. Fish can go. It depends on the size of the fish, but fish don't have to be fed every day, and they can go several days without feeding. And psychologically, we might think, oh, that's hurting the fish, but the opposite is potentially more harmful, because when a fish eats, it needs more oxygen to digest and the food. Then when the fish waste go into the water, you have heterotrophic bacteria that are breaking down that fish waste. They're consuming oxygen. And those heterotrophic bacteria are producing ammonia. And so now you have the nitrifiers, and they're consuming oxygen. So it is a good idea to eliminate or drastically reduce the amount of food if you know that some type of a disaster is coming.
All right, so then that is good advice.
Yeah. And the other thing to do while you still have filtration and water movement and things like that, and it relates to this, is clean the tank. Clean your filters, clean the substrate, siphon clean. Try to get as much organic material out of the water. Again, because that organic material, the bacteria are going to degrade it. They're not going to stop because there's no water movement or aeration in your tank. So if you have a lot of organic material, you're going to have a lot of bacterial activity, and that's going to consume oxygen and produce CO2 and produce ammonia. Two things that normally it's not a problem because you have a filter and a filtration system and aeration that's taking care of that. But if you don't have any water movement, no bubbling, nothing like that, you want to minimize the amount of ammonia and CO2 that's going in your water. So the first thing I recommend when you know there's a potential for a natural disaster or some type of disaster that you're going to lose or potentially lose electricity is clean your tank. Get as much organic material out, clean the canisters, clean the filters, just, get all that out of there. Your nitrifiers will be fine. You're not scrubbing the rock, pressure washing them. You're just siphon cleaning up as much as you can.
Yes, and I think that's too one of the things that we've talked about on one of our previous podcasts about like when you're preparing to go on vacation and you're going to be away from your tank. So like some of the basic maintenance things.
Right, that's very important. And then now some people say have spare water available, and that can be okay if you have a can of trash can or some type of buckets with spare water and you can do water changes. That can help too, assuming that new water or fresh water that you have has been aerated until the power went out. Then you take your old aquarium water out and throw that away and put the new water in. That can only go so far, maybe.
Yeah, that's true.
But it is, if you're going to change water, or thinking about changing water, it's good to have the water already made up, because some of the chemicals that you use to treat tap water are going to consume oxygen just in the chemical reaction. So get some new water beforehand and make sure you have it ready.
Yes. I feel like water is one of the things that almost at any given point in the day, in the week, month, whenever, I always have spare jugs of water sitting around, just something that I always have there.
Yeah, right. And now you have to be careful about thinking, well, I'll have plenty of water, because when the electricity goes out, the water still stays on. And in many cases, that's true. But if you're talking about maybe the Midwest, where there is a lot of flooding, typical disasters during certain times of the year are flooding, where they're telling you, don't drink the water, boil the water, things like that. And if the water's, my motto is, if the water's not good for humans, it's probably not good for your tank. I mean, that's maybe a little strict, but it's a criteria I have. If I wouldn't drink it, I'm not putting it in my fish aquarium.
That makes sense.
So I wouldn't count on that. It's always better to prepare, and that way you don't have to panic. You remember you're going to have to siphon the water out, so have smaller buckets because you're not going to have any electricity to pump the water any place, things like that.
Yes, that's a good point.
Yeah. Then the other things that can consume a lot of oxygen. Remember, plants reverse in the dark. So instead of producing oxygen, they can actually start to decay if the lights are off for a long period of time. So be careful about that, and don't add fertilizers, don't add different bacterial products, anything like that. Don't add to your chemicals and bacteria to your tank, because those are all oxygen consumers. And the whole idea is to keep as much oxygen in the water as you can until the electricity comes back on.
Yes, I feel like that if that's a good time. If your electricity is off, not a good time to be doing really anything with your tanks.
Right, anything.
Observing.
Yeah. Now, if you have plants and you have a window, and you open up the window and let the plants photosynthesize, because they'll be producing oxygen, which can help you. They can reoxygenate the water, but you can't always count on that depending on how your tank is. And most of us try to position it so the sunlight coming in from the windows is not bathing our tank in light, so that we don't get excess algae. And as Hilary just said, this is not really a time to do maintenance if the electricity is already off. So don't be scraping off algae and stuff like that, because that's all going to become dead organic material that the bacteria are going to start working on. And as I've mentioned many times, these heterotrophic bacteria, they start working in 20 minutes. They're fast. So if there's organic material there, they're going to start degrading it with or without oxygen.
Yes.
Key thing to have is battery-powered air pumps. They're not very expensive. Local store here has them for like $16. Yep. They last a long time. Like I say, when we were out of electricity for 3 days, now at both my house and the office here, we have generators, and we have systems that we can string electrical cords and have aeration and things like that. But we do have the battery-powered small. They're not much bigger than a old cassette recorder. Nobody knows what that is. I just stated myself. I was going to say, for
people that don't know what that is.
Sorry.
About the size of your cell phone.
Yeah, the fat cell phone. That's it. Better. Okay, have to get better analogies. But they work really well, and take a couple of C batteries, so have batteries on hand, and they last a couple of days. The ones here lasted really well. The other thing that we do, and just in case, because we get power outages for just a small amount of time, is I have our air pumps in the fish room and by the aquariums hooked up to uninterrupted power supplies, UPSs. Normally you plug your computer in those, so when the power goes out, your computer doesn't go out, and you've got time to shut down the computer and do what you need before whatever you were working on, you just don't lose it.
Yeah.
And those can be used with air pumps. They're not going to last days. But they'll last several hours, is what I found, and they can get you through a short period of time when the power is out without. Basically, it's automatic. The air pump's plugged into that. The power goes off. The air pump keeps on working, drawing down the battery from the uninterruptible power supply. The UPSs is what they're called. So there's one way of doing that, because out here, when it does get windy, and for some reason in the small town I live in, yes, there are small towns in California, we tend to have power go out for just a few hours here and there, later in the fall, especially.
Yep.
Or now, it is fire season. We're in the middle of a drought. Everybody's using extra electricity because, so hot and AC is we get the rolling brownouts. And usually they'll text you that that's happening. So you have somewhat of a warning, but they'll just, for maybe a couple hours, shut the electricity off to your building or your house. And if you're not there, what are you going to do? Well, with the uninterruptible power supplies, you're covered for a couple hours. So you just, much less stress on you, obviously a lot less stress on your aquarium.
Now, speaking of stress, so if you happen to know that one of these outages is coming, would you recommend adding some first defense to the tank?
Not beforehand, no, because first defense, being the vitamins and immunostimulant, it can cause bacterial action. After, yes, once everything's back on, the system's running, because the fish have been stressed, I would definitely add the first defense. But beforehand, no.
No. Okay.
Unless it's part of your water change, just to get rid of chlorine and chloramines, I would not.
Makes sense.
What I would recommend doing, we talk about cleaning it, getting some batteries and power supplies and portable air pumps. During the power outage, you don't have to run your filter. Some people think, well, you've got to run it. You really don't. You're kind of in this triage mode. But what I would run is maybe some type of wave maker or power head type, just an in-tank pump that's circulating the water and agitating the surface. You need to be moving the surface in water. That's how you get the air exchange, is by agitating the surface. And that can help with just water movement. Bubbles help, but there's lots of studies that show that the amount of oxygen air bubbles actually add to water is small compared to the amount of oxygen that just comes in by disrupting the air surface or the water surface. So
makes sense. And if you didn't have one, and I guess if you were in a pinch, you could probably say, take a clean cup and scoop water and pour it in over the top.
Oh yeah, just take your hand or something and just agitate the surface. Yep. Or like you say, take a cup and pour it down something like a cheese grater. You want to break the water up. You don't want a big, thick water film. You want to make the water as thin a film as possible and break it up. Think of what happens with a waterfall. And yeah, you make a little mess, but that's how you add air, is by disrupting that water and putting it in a very thin film.
Exactly. And I feel like I'm about to take a step back. We're talking about like air pumps and, having aeration in there. Even if you have the little battery powered air pumps, if you have some spare airline tubing, that might be a good idea. I know a lot of those little battery powered guys are meant to hang on the side of like a 5-gallon bucket. But personally, I've experienced not having enough line to get, from a good place to hang it on the side of the tank or somewhere on the tank and actually have that line stick in the water where I want it. So
yeah. And you should you've got this stuff, put it all together. Go through a mock-up of having a power outage. What are you going to do? Where are you going to put it? How much line do you need? I keep the batteries out of the portable air pumps, and they're in a box that says "Do not touch," so nobody, from the office here goes and grabs them, because you go to the box and it's empty because somebody says, "Oh, I need some batteries." That's not going to help you.
No.
But preparation is really the key that everything's going to work and it's all in a spot. And we have basically a power outage box. That's where the air pumps are. That's where the line is. Everything's measured and marked. We know what tanks they're going to go to. Batteries are right there. Because sometimes if you leave the batteries in for a long period of time, they get that corrosion.
Yep.
Those little things can just make the whole process a lot easier. Okay, and just because this is Murphy's Law, all this stuff happens in the dark, at night. Okay, do you have flashlights?
Yep.
Do you have there's a nice battery operated little lanterns you can get. It used to be like the Coleman lanterns when I was a kid, with gas and propane, stuff like that. But now they're battery powered LEDs and they're lightweight and they put off a lot of light and don't take a lot of energy and last a long time.
Oh yeah.
So have that kind of stuff. Preparation is really the key to getting through this.
Oh yeah. I lived in the Carolinas for a while during several hurricane seasons. And one thing I always had, I had a setup for each of my tanks, I'm like, all right, I know what fish are going in what bucket if I have to evacuate. I've got air pumps for all of them. I was set. I had, if I had to leave somewhere, I had some sort of media that I could put in the bottom of the buckets and the air pumps, and I could just take it all with me and go.
That's preparation.
I was always super paranoid, but I mean, I lived, I don't know, probably 10 minutes from the beach. So
yeah.
If a hurricane was coming through, I wanted to make sure I could get out if I needed to.
Yep. And one thing people have asked is what about all my corals? I can't run the lights. I'm not going to, or, should I run the lights? And if you have the energy, yes, you can run the lights, but corals in nature, there are hurricanes and they do last a while with lots of heavy cloudiness. And so corals can live in the dark. The sun's going to be up. So open up your windows, so it's not going to be completely black. So your coral should be fine for several days. But definitely, that's if you have your extensive coral tank, I would make plans to have water movement, just water moving past the corals, because that's how they get rid of really their waste, is that current moving past them. Again, no feeding is needed. They can go plenty of time without feeding.
Yep.
So,
what other things that I'd recommend people having just spare? Oh, I know. This is something I've recently experienced when if say you lose air conditioning, I like to use just gallon jugs that I can put water in and freeze it. And then I can put those jugs, they're sealed, cleaned. I know they're safe to go in the tank, and just put those big frozen ice blocks in the tank. So that might be something good to have on hand if you have space in the freezer to keep them.
That's a good idea. That is a good idea. That's one way to cool your tank, is to have those frozen blocks. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that one. So, okay.
Yep, I've unfortunately lost air conditioning for about a week, twice this summer already.
In Las Vegas.
In Las Vegas, yeah.
That's got to be unbearable.
Ooh, it was a good start to the summer.
Yeah. Okay. Some people have asked, what about a fan? And that's one way to cool a little bit your tank. But fans can take up a lot of energy. It just depends on how much spare energy you have. But opening up the surface and running having a fan blow across the surface can help a little bit. But again, it depends. If you have a big 150, 250 gallon tank, I don't think it's going to work too much. That's a lot of water that you're trying to cool down.
Oh yeah. A whole lot of water.
Yeah. So now you've prepped, you've got through the whatever it is. what do you do when now the electricity comes back on, the AC comes back on? What should you do? And first thing is clean your filter. If it's been sitting there, clean it, rinse the pads, get all that water out of there. If you've got a sealed canister filter, get all that water out of there. Because again, our friends the bacteria haven't stopped working. They consumed all the oxygen in that canister. Once they did that, they started producing or consuming nitrate or other chemicals because they keep on working, and they're going to produce something probably, if the power's been out for a long time, hydrogen sulfide, which your nose is going to quickly tell you that this is something I don't want in the tank. But resist just popping that filter back on. Clean it out, rinse it out. Don't worry about the nitrifiers. Just clean everything so you don't have any of the potential toxins going back into your water. If you've got static water lines, water lines, a lot of people don't ever clean their tubings, their tubing. And that's got a lot of dirt in it, stuff like that. And that biofilm in there is all potentially, it's all organic, so it can all be broken down. So get all the water out of those stagnant water lines and start over fresh as much as you can with all that material. If you've got media in a canister, rinse that really well, because all that stuff can have trapped gases that you don't want to put back into your aquarium.
Yes. Excellent, excellent reminders.
And I would run the water run the filters, aerate for a while before feeding. You might be, okay, the water's back on, electricity's back on, let's start feeding. Your fish and corals are going to be okay, right? And get things running, get the filtration going, make sure the fish are doing well, and then start feeding them. You don't just start throwing food into the tank.
No. Like you mentioned earlier, this would be, give it a bit, but maybe this is a good time to add first defense. If they're stressed out, this will help them.
Exactly. Now, what are some indications? Let's step back a little bit. You're in the middle of this. You've had the power, portable air pump or battery air pump. What are indications that whatever you're doing is not working? If your fish are porpoising, meaning they're kind of tail down, head up, and they're up at the surface, or they're kind of swimming around at the surface, gasping at the surface, that's a clear sign something's wrong. Yeah. Obviously, if they're lying on their sides at the bottom of the tank, well, that's a clear sign.
Something's wrong.
Something's wrong. Murphy's Law is your favorite fish will be the first one that will start experiencing problems.
No, don't say that.
So, I mean, what can you do? And really manually stirring the tank. Somehow drop the water level a little bit by taking some water out and then pour water through something, as we were just talking about, to really get into a thin film, and do that vigorously. Vigorously do that to add oxygen to the water. You're taking water out and pouring it right back in through some type of a washboard, some type of a screen, just anything that can make it thin. Just taking it out of a bucket and pouring it back in is really not is not going to help a lot. In super extreme cases, it probably is better to move the fish from the aquarium water to the water that you had in the buckets or trash cans that you were doing water changes with, because that water has no organics, no substrate that has organics or things like that. I mean, it's an extreme measure, but if your fish are laying on their sides, or if your fish are up at the surface, that's just a clear sign that you've got to take some drastic measures, and that water is not a good environment for them. So get them into some some fresh water, fresh salt water that hasn't had any fish in it, and that's probably going to have a lot more oxygen in it.
Yes. Now here's the question, and I don't know if I even have the right product. I feel like when I've seen fish shipments come in that they have, I think, is it methylene blue maybe?
Right.
That they package them with to help with oxygen in the water. Am I on track with that?
Well, the methylene blue is an antimicrobial to a certain degree. So you're keeping bacteria from dividing, which is when they do that, they're going to consume oxygen. So that's how you're kind of helping with the oxygen.
Okay. So that wouldn't work. I was like, oh, well, if you take your fish out and you can put them in, that spare clean water or whatever, you can put some of that in the water and help with the oxygen, but probably
no,
not as
I mean,
helpful as I thought.
no, because the other thing you could do, and this is again extreme cases, is adding hydrogen peroxide to the water.
Oh.
That'll aerate, and that's what some of those. There's some devices that they don't they'll aerate, and they claim they don't need any batteries or any electricity or stuff like that, and it's all based on hydrogen peroxide, and that does work.
Okay.
The other thing to consider is salt. The saltier the water, the less oxygen it can hold. That's just the physics of seawater. So in your preparation, if your fish, and most fish can handle a lower salinity,
yep,
consider lowering the salinity just a few parts if you can, from 34 to 30 or down to 28. I mean, that's 6 parts out of 34. That's almost a 20% drop in salinity, and there's charts that you can go to, but you're going to get a big increase in the amount of oxygen the water can hold, and your fish would be fine.
I like that. Going back to the basics, I hadn't thought about that. That's a good idea.
Yeah, I mean, that's how we ran the hatchery, because in the desert when I was raising, is you just look at your salinity. You don't have to run it at 34, and the oxygen levels are much higher at lower levels, and most all fish can handle that. Now, what about using pure oxygen? I mean, that's how we used to ship fish. We used to drive fish from our farm in Central California down to the farm in Southern California for hours in tanks, and we ship fish in bags. We're using pure oxygen. I mean, that can work. You need a regulator and air tubing and air stones. But if you have a system that is really big, consider getting canisters of oxygen. Be careful with it, but they've got the breathers, that produce oxygen, and there's ways you can adapt that to a system. They actually run on electricity, some of those, but some of them are portable, so they're battery operated, something like that. There are newer ways and more compact ways of generating air and oxygen from batteries and things like that you can adapt to your fish tank.
All sorts of possibilities.
Yeah. So the main thing you're trying to do is, how can I get through this until the power comes back on? Power comes back on, as we said, clean the filters, as much as tubing, as all that stuff, get the system running and stabilized. Then you can start feeding. If you've got a heavy plant tank, coral tank, get the lights back on, get photosynthesis going. That's nature's way of aerating. And then don't just think everything's great. Okay, power's back on, everything's great. Observe your fish, observe your animals, because they've been stressed. So are they going to start breaking down? The first defense is a great way to help combat any potential stress, but observe them to see if they start getting blotches, if their fins start getting frayed, and then figure out what action you're going to take. Because as with any type of disease, if you catch it early enough, you can generally successfully treat it.
Yes. And something else that you can do very, very proactively. If you're listening to this podcast right now, go through and take this as a reminder to tidy up and clean up your tank. Clean up those hoses that are going in between your tank and your filters. Make sure that your pumps are, clean and will start back up when the power comes back on. Make sure that you have all of the stuff. Do a good cleaning of your substrate or your gravel.
Yeah. Preventative maintenance. It'll definitely save you a lot of time and a lot of grief and a lot of stress.
Yes.
Yeah. And now's the time, you read about, the hurricanes coming or the heat wave or something like that, and everybody's at the store. Don't wait till everybody's at the store getting batteries and flashlights. Get your kit. Here in California, everyone has an earthquake kit. You're supposed to be able to have water and flashlights, things like that for a couple of days. Do the same thing right now for your aquarium. Get a kit together, mark it so the rest of the family doesn't steal stuff from it, and clean buckets and things like that, and be prepared. And it makes just a world of difference to be prepared. Can't stress that enough.
Nope, not at all. Now, in addition to First Defense, are there any of our other products that you would recommend? Obviously not before, because we've talked about that, but after things come back up online.
Well, I would recommend the Waste Away it's to get rid of all those organics. You've got good aeration just to take care of any but organics that haven't been degraded completely, and then maybe some of the one and only, because you might have areas where you're going to be producing high amounts of ammonia for a little bit of time. The bacteria can get stressed. If you had areas where a little bit of hydrogen sulfide was being produced, hydrogen sulfide is one of the few things that can kill nitrifiers. Luckily, your test kits will tell you've been circulating the water, do a quick ammonia nitrite test. And if you've got those in the water, considering adding some of the nitrifying bacteria to boost the biological filter.
That's a good point.
Other than that, those are the three ones. The First Defense can really, really help. We use that as a bagging solution. So definitely that's my go-to after any type of incident where there's potentially stressed fish. No.
Oh, yeah.
Heat, there's a lot of out here in the West, heat's the big thing. And if you lose your AC, say, it's not a quote world or a regional disaster, but you just lose your AC. What are you going to tell us, Hilary?
It's awful. It's miserable.
You live where the nighttime temperatures are 100 degrees.
Yes.
And a fan can help, or maybe, like you say, frozen water. Try to keep that down.
Somebody recommended to me when I was sharing that I had all these issues that they used to wrap their tanks like any sort of insulating material, like cardboard or bubble wrap, and then blankets that they used to put around it, that would help to hold the temperatures in. I'm not sure if they meant that for heat or just cold or both, but
well, no, it's both, because one thing about water is that it's I'm going to get this, like the latent heat. There's a term for the fact that if you say you had a tank that's 2 foot by 4 foot by 2 foot, that amount of air can quickly change temperature. But because you've got that amount of water does not change temperature fast. It holds that temperature. So just think about it. If you put cold water in a thermos, it stays cold. If you put hot water in the same thermos, it stays hot. The thermos doesn't care whether the water is cold or hot. It's just insulating it. And so the person that told you that, that's not a bad idea. You can, get some of that thick styrofoam and basically insulate your tank, because the water won't lose the coolness that it has as fast, because it's not being affected by the heat, because it has to go through the insulation. Now, I don't know about Vegas, where the daytime temperatures are 114 and you don't have air conditioning, but it's worth a shot. But it's, it's people sometimes wonder, well, how does the thermos know it's hot or cold? Well, it doesn't care whether it's hot or cold. It's going to insulate the inside from the outside. So and water's one of those, is great because it does hold the temperature, whatever it has, quite well. And,
you're talking about this and I was like, I should have known that when I do all my scuba diving and stuff. Like, you get in the water, you're going to lose body heat much quicker. The water will stay its temperature.
Yeah, even if you wear a surf suit, a skinny suit, something over your skin, you're going to retain your heat a lot longer than if you're just, in a bathing suit with no protection at all, because a lot more of your skin is exposed to the water, which is generally, cooler, unless you're out in the Florida Keys. That water can be hot. But so and with your aquarium, if you have a big tank, you probably have pretty thick glass or plastic, which is a decent insulator, but you don't have anything on top. That's where you're going to lose most of the cool temperature from the water, is through the top. So at least you could insulate the surface. But now you got to think, well, how do I aerate if I'm insulating the surface? And there's where you've got to maybe have a little space there, and vigorously aerate and agitate and move the water. But in extreme cases, turning your tank into the inside of a thermos is not a bad idea like that.
Yep. The only thing I don't like about that is not being able to see the fish if I do have my tank wrapped up in blankets. Yeah,
you can't forget them. That's why I say you got to be looking at your fish, a flashlight, and see where they are and if they're coming up to the surface and how things are doing, so you can be prepared. Yep.
And if it's just your air conditioning that you've lost and you haven't already turned off the lights, go ahead and turn off the lights.
Yeah.
Because that will save you as well.
So as we've mentioned many times, though, the real key is preparation. Plan things, do a dry run, make sure you have everything you need and you know where it is and you know how to set it up, and try not to panic, and try to, you can generally get through this. I can't promise in extreme cases, but it's better than just throwing up your hands and going, I don't know what to do. What am I going to do?
Yep. Just take a deep breath, step at a time. You'll get through it.
Yeah. I mean, we, years ago, I managed a fish farm out in the desert. We used liquid oxygen, and we would lose power. We had a backup generator, but even that wasn't enough because we were raising fish at high densities, 1.5 pounds of fish per gallon of water. Ooh. And so we would actually had this wheel with spokes on it, because tanks were round, and it would drop down, and the spokes were these airline tubings, and the liquid oxygen, we had several of these tanks that looked like missiles. They just turn on the liquid oxygen and it would aerate the water.
Huh, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, so there are ways, and you can nice conversation maybe to have on our social media is different ideas that people have, and share with everyone about how you've gotten through some of these incidents. Out here, it's mostly battery backup and portable oxygen air pumps. So.
Yep. So if you're listening to this, do connect with us on social media, Facebook, Instagram. We love talking to you and love hearing your successes for these things. They can be daunting and intimidating, but the more information that we share and get out there in the community, hopefully the more success everyone will have as a whole.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone. And please write in with your ideas and suggestions on this topic and others. And we always enjoy reading the emails and talking with people. And we've been to a couple of shows already. And we've got some more for the rest of the year with the Reefapaloozas and Aquashellas and things like that. So please stop by if you're going to be at one of these and say hi.
Yep. And if you have questions, I totally forgot, go ahead and submit your questions because we are going to be doing our Q&A podcast. I believe it's next week. So if you've got those questions, go ahead and get them submitted so we can include them in our next podcast.
All right. Thanks, everyone. This is Dr. Tim and Hilary. Until next time, good fish keeping.